I'm Joanna Simpson here at RiskMinds International in London. Joining me now is Dr. Philipp Wackerbeck, Global Head of Financial Services at Strategy. And thank you very much for joining me.
Hi, Joanna. Thanks for being here.
And we also have Meryl Harland, Banking Treasury Leader at PwC. Thank you as well.
Thanks, Joanne.
And Philipp, if I may start with you, please. Geopolitics is on top of the C-level agenda, as it's among the main risk drivers in the short and medium term. How should FS players and banks in particular deal with such alternative risks?
Yeah, we've already seen this during the IMF and IIF meetings in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, that in every presentation, every discussion, every CEO was saying it's really about geopolitics. And most importantly, it's to understand what are the real implications for financial institutions. There are obviously opportunities in that space, but most importantly, and we are at RiskMinds, right, it's about risks and challenges. And that is why it's first and foremost to get a bit more of a structured framework of how financial institutions should assess the impact of geopolitics. At the end, it translates through two key transmission channels. One is obviously the financial markets itself. So what does it mean for equity prices? What does it mean for commodity prices? What does it mean for bond yields and so on? But most importantly and most difficult to assess is what does it mean for the real economy? How does it impact growth? How does it impact different geographies, different sectors? And ultimately corporate clients of banks, and how are the business models impacted? How does that translate into risk ratings, into ultimately potentially defaults, NPLs and so on? And I think there's a whole suite of things financial institutions need to do in order to first and foremost structure where exactly is the impact and how big, how significant is the impact potentially.
And in your presentation, you alluded to ecosystem sensing as being particularly important to detect, assess, and mitigate geopolitical and macroeconomic risks. What is crucial for banks in embracing this approach?
Yeah, this is a very important approach, as we've learned over the past 18 to 24 months. When you reflect on many things that happened, starting with the banking crisis in the US and Switzerland some 18 months ago, that let's say the capabilities of the existing early warning systems was pretty limited. Most of the leading indicators, so-called leading indicators, turned out to be not really leading. And that's why there's a significant upgrade of the whole infrastructure for early warning systems is required. And one of the most important concepts in that context is what we call ecosystem sensing. And that means that financial institutions, particularly banks, need to much better understand in what context their clients are operating in, going back to geopolitical risk, going back to macroeconomic risk, but also on the climate side. Many different risk factors impacting the ultimately what happens to the balance sheet and P&L of their clients. Yeah? And this is where financial institutions need to have a much better understanding how the entire value chain of a client is impacted under different scenarios, and then how does that translate into their financial KPIs at the end. And that's why this concept, it's conceptually not fundamentally new, but it has to be much more sophisticated than it was in the past, where we could rely a lot on historical data sets and series and just project them forward. Now it is much more complicated, and that's why more attention needs to be devoted to that particular area.
And Meryl, if I may come to you, please. Risk functions need to adequately manage the transmission of geopolitical and macroeconomic risks into market risks. So what implications does that have for the risk function's importance and organisation?
So I think it starts with culture. The risk function is not only critical, it's absolutely paramount in managing geopolitical risk. Many institutions will already have some form of a country risk exposure framework, but that's not adequate, and we've seen that. It's not adequate for managing unexpected, future geopolitical disruption. It is very much based, like Philipp said, on backward-looking data rather than forward-looking. So the risk function needs to drive forward how that type of framework is converted into something that's fit for purpose for the future. So the type of horizon scanning and sentiment views that are needed to understand how a really rapidly changing landscape is developing. I think the other thing that the risk function can do is make sure that the risk strategy of the firm when it comes to operating in different locations that are exposed to geopolitical risk is really disseminated properly throughout a large complex organization. It's not something that's just said at the top. It's really all the way down to trade booking level understood and made sure that the whole firm is, complying with that strategy so that the unexpected pockets of risk do not occur over time.
There's a consistent view that investments into technology, including AI, need to be enhanced in the FS sector to address geopolitically induced challenges such as regulation. So which immediate steps do FS players need to take to not fall behind?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We were hearing from William Hague earlier, who said that the world is becoming not only more exciting, but also more dangerous. And I think AI has a role to play on both sides of that. But in terms of harnessing the power of AI to manage those risks, one of the things that firms can start to do is using many of the AI solutions that are out there to look at changing sentiment, changing events, really test the water on what's happening so you can start to really understand if there's a changing tide. I mean, you can imagine how data of that kind would have been very useful during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So making sure that you're using those sort of horizon scanning pieces of technology is a start. Secondly, we touched in our session about the importance of management information for quick decision making. Having really clear data warehouses and data portals that allow you to make real-time decision making, and the data doesn't have any latency to it, so you're seeing today what's on your balance sheet, is key. AI can also play a role in helping you to eventually query that data and understand it in more of a real-time scenario. So some sort of chatbot you can imagine is a use case for having somewhere that you can start asking and playing around with what will happen, what if scenarios.
Meryl and Philip, thank you very much for joining me today.